So my name is Karen Green. I'm the curator for comics and cartoons here in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library. I also started a circulating collection, which is down on the 4th floor, which you're welcome to investigate. It's got roughly 20,000 titles in over 24 languages, so have fun. I started that collection in 2005, and then in 2010, I was offered an archive, the archive of Chris Claremont, who's my superhero, folks. Who knows Chris Claremont? X-Men, yes. He had the longest run on X-Men ever. All the movies are based on his stories, all of them. I was not working up here. I was in the circulating collection division, and I got an email from Chris's wife saying, hey, Chris would like to donate his papers to a university. Are you interested? And I'm like, well, I'm interested. I can't say yes. So I came up and spoke to the director of Rare Books, and he said, sure, who else can you get? And so I was off to the races. I was an adjunct curator. And then in 2016, they created this job for me, curator for comics and cartoons. They actually said, what do you want to call yourself? I'm like, curator for comics and cartoons. And I've been up here since then, since I moved up here in February 2017. So some of the things I'll show you have been here since long before I arrived, like this. Some of them are things that I acquired, but all of them give you a sense of what we have in our archive and what might be useful for researchers to look at. This is probably the oldest comics material in the archive. This was done by students here making fun of a professor whom they hated. But they weren't Columbia College students because Columbia did not exist yet. They were King's College students because this was done in 1766, wow. 10 years before the Revolution. It is not just old, it is not just cool, it is nasty. So the actual name of the professor was Stephen Harper, but they're calling him Patrick Cornell Pagan, College Intrigues, or the Amours of Patrick Cornell Pagan. Pagan is in his sitting room. He tells his manservant to invite over this young woman. He plies her with spruce beer, gets her drunk, gets her into bed, gets her pregnant, gets her an abortion. 1766. Did
that actually happen though?
No, it did not actually happen. In addition to this sort of accusation, though, there's also a lot of anti-Irish sentiment in here. So this brown pile is labeled "Potatoes Just Come from Cork." There's an Irish harp behind the bed, and when she tells him she's pregnant, and he says, I'm going to get you an abortion, there's this tiny little animal with a very big speech balloon saying, oh, you Irish hypocrite.
Oh, I can read that.
Yes, you can. This is kind of amazing. Most people I show this to who are comics historians had no idea that speech balloons were that prevalent enough for students to know about them in 1766. So this is a pretty cool piece, if I do say so myself. But this was in the university archive. The university archivist is the one who told me about it. We know it's 1766 because every bad piece of behavior was marked in this big book known as the Black Book. And the confiscation of this piece is marked there. And it was just like tossed into a pile of papers that made it into the, I mean, I'm not sure when the university archivist discovered it, but she was pretty psyched when she did. So, if you were to be asked, who is the father of the graphic novel, who would you say?
I feel like it's someone in ancient times.
There are things that are comic-like that go back to antiquity, but maybe a little bit more recent.
We've got to call someone who actually made it popular, right? Google says Will Eisner.
Right, so he is considered the father of the graphic novel because he published something called A Contract with God in 1978. Not actually a long form, it's a story cycle of 4 cycles, but he called it, he didn't invent the term, but he called it a graphic novel, and he popularized that term. But there are other people older than Will Eisner who also get this kind of retroactive title. And one of them is this gentleman, Rodolphe Töpfer, who did a book. This is actually an English translation. He was a Swiss artist who did a book called L'Histoire de Monsieur Vieuxbois, the story of Mr. Oldwood. And he published that in 1837. And in 1841 in London, an English translation was made called The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck. And you can see that while it doesn't have speech balloons, it does, have sequential visual. It tells a fabulous story of unrequited love. I know, right? And his multiple attempts to kill himself as a result, all of which are unsuccessful. This is my favorite one. He ties himself to a chair so that he can starve to death, but then these mice come in and they gnaw through the ropes and he's free. And after every failed attempt, let me see if I can find it. He changes, no, he doesn't succeed. After every failed attempt, he changes his underwear. It's like it says, Mr. Oldbuck changes his underwear.
Comedic, right?
Comedic, yes, it's comedic. Comics in America, this was actually published in America in 1842 in a humor magazine called Brother Jonathan here in New York, because New York City is the birthplace of American comics. Don't ever forget it. That was one of my arguments for starting the collection. We are a New York City institution as are comics. There was a cartoonist. Has anybody ever heard of Jerry Robinson? Yeah, I know you're gonna know all the answers, aren't you? Because he's not the high school guy. Jerry Robinson was a comic book artist. One day he was on vacation at a resort. He was wearing a white jacket on which he had drawn things, and a guy walked up to him and said, "Hey, I like your jacket. Who drew that?" And Jerry said, "I drew that." And the guy said, "Yeah, would you like a job?" And that guy was Bob Kane, who co-created Batman. Bob Kane was the artist for Batman, but he was not actually a very good artist. So he invited Jerry to come in as a ghost. Jerry's name is nowhere on these comics. It still says Batman by Bob Kane, even though they were being written by Bill Finger and drawn by Jerry Robinson. Wow. Because that was the contract that Bob Kane got DC Comics to give him. Wow. He was a lousy artist, but a good businessman. So Jerry continued drawing comics through late 40s, I'd say, and then he moved on to doing book illustration, to doing syndicated comics, and he also became an historian of the medium. And he wrote a book called The Comics, which was actually about comic strips, and for that book he collected a lot of tear sheets of old comic strips. And this is the oldest one. This is a very historical one. How many people have heard of Hogan's Alley? Or the Yellow Kid? It's okay. You don't need to know. Hogan's Alley is, again, not literally, but often referred to as the earliest comic strip. It starred a little tenement boy named Mickey Dugan who wore a long yellow nightshirt on which his dialogue appeared. This is it began in black and white. This is the first color Hogan's Alley. It ran on May 5th, 1895. 1895. He's not yellow yet, though. He's wearing a blue nightshirt and he's got no dialogue, and he's a lot younger than Mickey Dugan would turn out to be. But this is, Jerry collected a few yellow kids. He stored them in this lovely sketchbook in between the pages so that they would not get in even worse condition than they already were. You can see they're very fragile. This one had been split entirely in two, but I sent it down to conservation and they removed the tape and they mended it, the tear, and they put it in this lovely Mylar so that it looks almost like new and not at all as crappy as it looked when I first saw it.
Where would it have been ripped from?
Oh, so Joseph Pulitzer, whose name went on to be associated with the Pulitzer Prize, he published a paper called The New York World. And he had bought this fabulous four-color press, this massive, massive four-color press. And he wanted to reproduce the old masters for the masses. But he discovered that a 4-color press does not reproduce the masters in the greatest quality. So somebody said, maybe we could use it to color those comics you've been running. And he was off to the races. So this ran in the New York World. The Yellow Kid became so phenomenally popular that William Randolph Hearst, who owned a rival paper, the Journal American, stole the artist, R.F. Outcult, and started running him under the name McFadden's, under the title McFadden's Flats in his paper. And then Pulitzer went out and found another artist to come in and continue Hogan's Alley. And there was a huge circulation war. And because of the Yellow Kid, and because of the fact that both of these publishers were kind of jingoistic, pro-Spanish-American War types, that's where the term yellow journalism comes from. It's associated with the Yellow Kid and with the kind of journalism that ran in these two papers. I mentioned how popular the Yellow Kid became. It's almost impossible to, you're all wearing Columbia t-shirts, which is awesome. I'm sure you don't wear this in your private life. Many people have t-shirts that sport things that they're fans of. Not a lot of people wearing t-shirts in the 1890s, early 1900s, but the Yellow Kid showed up on sheet music, on cigar boxes, on hat boxes, on stationery, you name it. He was like the first big transmedia star. And while I don't have an example of that for the Yellow Kid, right in front of you, you see a piece of sheet music from a review dedicated to Little Nemo. Little Nemo in Slumberland was a famous comic strip done by a guy named Winsor McCay. And this ran on Broadway. The music was by Victor Herbert, who was like the king of light operetta. It was produced by Cohan and Harris. And if any of you, which I doubt very few of you have ever seen the movie Yankee Doodle Dandy, which is about George M. Cohan, played by Jimmy Cagney, came out in 1942. You will know who George M. Cohan was. And Sam Harris was his partner. So this just thrilled me when I saw it. So that's something that I acquired, because why not? So I'm going to come out from behind this table and come over to behind the next table and show you some more stuff. There are many things that kind of count as proto-comics. So, for example, there was a comic strip that was very popular called The Katzenjammer Kids, and it was about these two brothers, Hans and Fritz, who were hellions. They were like, they blow people up and just laugh and laugh and laugh. But they were based on these two German characters named Max and Moritz. And those were not comics, those were just illustrated books. But they kind of count as proto-comics because they went on. This is an example, I think, of something that counts as proto-comics. This is a book designed by a man named Lothar Meggendorfer, the king of the pop-up book. This is not a pop-up book, however. This is a book that has a little story over here. Oh wait, this is a better one. I like this one better. Hold on. Ah. This is so not how I should be turning this. Oh wait, maybe I need to go back farther. That's why it wasn't. Yeah, this is the one I want to show. So you've got a nice little story about this intellectual reading his book at the zoo. You see there's a tab at the bottom, and if you pull this tab...
Whoa.
Not everybody can see. So yeah, move over and let them. So it starts out like this. He's reading his book, and the monkeys are behind him, and then the monkeys have like completely taken all of his stuff. Yeah, and the whole book is just full of.
That's so cool.
Go on a picnic, and then the weather turns poorly.
You can't even simply print it.
No, exactly. This is a whole mechanical thing. But I consider this, because it has sequence. This is kind of comics related.
So how much would have it cost when someone would have bought it back then?
That would have been for a kid. It would
much
not have been expensive. This was published in 1910. If I told you a number, it would be almost meaningless because the value of the price has changed so much. So if I told you it was 5 cents, which it wasn't, it was probably more, 5 cents went a lot further in 1910 than it does today. So that would have been actually more expensive than it sounds. Okay, another example of a transmedia star were the characters from a strip called Bringing Up Father. Bringing Up Father was like the first sitcom. Maggie and Jiggs, married couple, Irish immigrants. They win the Irish sweepstakes. They become millionaires. Jiggs just wants to have his old life back. He wants to drink beer with his buddies and eat corned beef and cabbage. But Maggie, she's a social climber. And she is constantly getting angry with Jiggs for ruining some sort of thing that's going to make her, the belle of New York society. So here's Jiggs, and here's Maggie, and their daughter Sweetums. Or Sweetie. No, Sweetie. They've got another one. There's another. Sweetums is another one. Maggie is holding her rolling pin because this is the origin of the trope of the angry wife going after her father, going after her husband with a rolling pin. And this is a piece of sheet music from another review called Bringing Up Father in Wall Street. And this is a piece of original Bringing Up Father art from 1930. Which I still can't believe I was able to acquire for something that did not break the bank. He had a great signature. I love his signature. And this is a very relatable story. Jiggs is asleep. His alarm goes off, picks up his alarm clock, throws it out the window, goes back to sleep. It's happened to many of us, I'm sure.
Yeah. Maybe not out the window.
Maybe not out the window, but metaphorically. Exactly. Didn't have snooze on the old kinds of alarm clocks. So this is something that came to us also as part of the Jerry Robinson papers. He not only collected tear sheets, but he collected original art. And this is a remarkable thing that I get chills every time I see it. So how many people have ever heard of Crazy Cat? Okay, Crazy Cat with K's, Crazy Cat. Crazy Cat was a gender fluid feline who was in love with a mouse named Ignatz. Ignatz did not return her favor, and he threw bricks at her, or him. Crazy's gender and sometimes her color are very fluid. So this is Crazy. And this is George Harriman, the artist, in his actual house in Los Angeles, calling down to, he's wearing a hat. I'll get back to that, why that's important. He's calling down to Crazy, and there's 2 Scots Terriers here. George Harriman had 5 Scots Terriers, so that's 2 of them, and it's like a little joke. So, why does George Harriman wear a hat? George Harriman was born in the South, and on his birth certificate, his race was listed as colored. But he was very light-skinned, and he was able to pass through his entire life. The cartoonists that he hung out with nicknamed him Harry the Greek because he had a Mediterranean complexion, but he kept that hat on to cover his hair. But here is a photograph of him without a hat. This is extremely rare. And there's an inscription underneath that says, "Hey Bert, the flash of the pan herewith is not Wales," meaning the Prince of Wales, who was a big style icon at the time, or John Barrymore, who was a matinee idol, but me. If I was wrong about you wanting this well, and then the rest is cut off. And that's cool because Bert is Bert Green, who was an animator on the silent Crazy Cat cartoons. So there's just a ton of history wrapped up in this very small piece of illustration board and ink. And I'm very excited that we have that. So, moving on again. So we've had Will Eisner as a father of the graphic novel. We've had Rodolphe Töpfer as a father of the graphic novel. Now you're going to see one more father of the graphic novel. And his name is Lind Ward. Lind Ward would have been horrified to have been considered the father of the graphic novel or to have been associated with comics really at all. This is a first edition of God's Man, a novel in woodcuts. This is a wordless novel drawn in woodcuts. Which was inspired by wordless woodcut novels that had been done in Europe earlier. This came out in 1930. And while the European woodcut novels kind of really look like woodcuts. This is a level of artistry of a carving of wood that is just a whole other level. You page through it. There's one image per page, always on the recto side. And believe it or not, you can go through this and you can tell the entire story. When I teach my class about how to read comics in the summertime, I put this up on the screen and I just go through each image and I have my students call out and tell me what's happening next. Okay, what's happening now? And they all get it. They all can absolutely tell the story. There's actually a prize named for Lind Ward that's given out by the Center for the Book at Penn State University for the best graphic novel of the year. And as I say, I'm sure you would be absolutely horrified. This was something that we already had in the collection. We have several of Lind Ward's first editions. He did 6 during his lifetime, was working on a 7th when he died. Again, Jerry Robinson, we've been getting his library. His son has been giving us all the books that were in his library. And whenever I get a book, I look in our catalog to see if we already own it. This is a book called Sport Drawings by Percy Crosby. Percy Crosby was a cartoonist who did a strip about a little boy named Skippy. So we got a copy from Jerry Robinson, and I look in our catalog and it says we already have a copy in Rare Books. I'm like, wow, well maybe that copy is kind of beat up. Let me see if this is a better copy. So I go to the stacks and I pull this out and I open it up and I'm looking through and then I see where is it?
Whoa.
Yeah. Correct response. So he self-published 1,000 copies, and this is number 401 for Columbia University from P.L. Crosby.
Wow.
Yeah. Beautiful handwriting, right? Yeah, and it's all gold ink and
So
artistic. He was extremely talented. So needless to say, Jerry's copy did not supplant this copy. It went in addition. Or actually, no, I think I might have given it away. So one of the things I find really interesting is not simply original art, which is awesome, or original books, which are awesome, but the things that reflect the way that cartoonists and publishers did their work, like how the business aspect of it. And this is a lovely example. There was a cartoonist in the 30s named Jimmy Murphy who did a strip called Toots and Casper. And this is his log. The date that the comic strip he needed to send was going to be released, the date it was due in New York, the date and time that he mailed it, the subject, how it was mailed, when it arrived in New York, and then any remarks. And this is all hand-drawn, inked, and colored by himself. This is not published in any way. He's doodled Toots' face up in the corner. And, this is the sort of thing that would probably be in like an Excel spreadsheet now, but this is how they did it old school. So Jerry Robinson, I don't know if I mentioned this, he was a student at Columbia. When he met Bob Kane, he was going to study journalism, but he had met Bob Kane. He continued as a student for a while, but eventually he realized that he was going to do a lot better in life drawing comics than he was going into journalism. But this is from one of his notebooks from a statistics class that he had just started sketching Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson on, because everybody doodles on their notebook when they're in class, right? So this clearly had to be from after he met Bob Kane, not simply because it's these characters, but because Robin was somebody who Jerry helped design. Jerry was responsible for the visuals of 3 characters, the Joker, Robin, and Alfred the Butler. And we have his copy of an edition of Robin Hood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, illustrated by N.C. Wyeth, which has a drawing of Robin Hood that was directly influenced his costume for Robin. So.
Is that his math work?
Yeah, I think it's a statistics class. We don't have a ton of comic books, but sometimes I like to pick up a comic book that is less likely to have been reprinted and has some sort of interesting significance. This is a wartime comic, Star Spangled Comics, a cover by Joe Simon, who was a partner with, anybody know who Joe Simon partnered with? No. Siegel and Schuster. Simon and Kirby. So Jack Kirby, who created almost everyone in the Marvel Universe except for Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, was a partner with Joe Simon early on. They created Captain America in 1941. They created the entire genre of romance comics. And while Kirby became possibly more of a legend, Joe Simon was no slouch, and this is a Joe Simon cover. So. And it's a nice wartime comic. Newsboy Legion Canteen welcomes servicemen. So you see all these nice soldiers hanging out with the superheroes. Again, sorry, I'm going to sneak behind you here. No, you're good, you're good, you're good. Again, as I said, I like things that show the process of the business. And this is original art for a Sunday comic called Napoleon by Clifford McBride. Can you see what's over the white areas in addition to the ink? Pencil marks, blue pencil marks.
Oh, and they like say colors for color.
Exactly. So it's indicating what colors, everything. So this is DG for dark green. This is G for green. This is tan. This is light green. Does anybody know why it's in blue pencil? Well, it wasn't a scanner, it was photography at the time. But yes, blue pencil did not show up. So often editorial marks would be done in blue pencil, which is why sometimes when you refer to an editor looking at a manuscript, you say it's, he blue penciled this or he blue penciled that. But also sometimes pencilers would draw their originals in blue pencil so that when the inker went over it, they didn't have to erase the pencil. So we've mostly seen guys so far, right? Yeah. Where were the women? Well, they're right here. So Lily Renee was an amazing character. She was evacuated from Austria on the Kindertransport, sent to the UK because she was Jewish, a young Jewish girl in Austria at the onset of the Nazi era. Evacuated to the UK. Oh,
sorry,
hello.
Siri just went off. Oh my God.
And then later joined her parents in New York. She was a very fine artist. We have several pieces of her youthful art from when she was 16 or so, and they're spectacular. But when she came to New York and she wanted to get a job, she saw a listing in the newspaper that a publisher named Fiction House, which was one of the lesser-known comics publishers, was looking for an artist. So this is actually her audition panel. It's Tarzan and Jane, and she got the job. And she went on to draw a lot of comics, including Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, and others, and died a year and a half ago at the age of 102. Oh. Next to her is another woman cartoonist, Jill Elgin. This is from a series called Girl Commandos, which was kind of a counterpart to a Simon and Kirby series called Boy Commandos. This is the work of somebody who's just starting her comics career. This is the work of somebody who's got an extremely confident hand in her comics career. This is a beautiful page. I still can't believe we have it. I say that about a lot of the stuff here, but I can't believe that I'm even here, much less that we have this stuff. Really beautifully expressive faces, nice use of white gouache here to highlight the icicles. This would have rendered interestingly when it was published. Just a beautiful page from 1944. But now we're going to leave the wartime era behind and come to a little bit more of the modern era. We have the records of Kitchen Sink Press. Kitchen Sink Press was an underground comics press. Who knows what an underground comic is? You've never heard of it. You have no reason to have heard of it. Back in 1954, there was a panic over comic books because basically everybody panics about whatever kids like, whether it's comic books, video games, rock and roll, rap, you name it. So in 1954, the big bad was comic books. And there was actually a Senate hearing for the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency. And they had a star witness, a psychologist named Frederick Wortham, who had written a book called Seduction of the Innocent, which detailed the juvenile delinquency of his patients who read comic books. Just a few years ago, it was proved that he faked an enormous amount of his data, but there you go. He was a star witness. The witness for the comics publishers was Bill Gaines, publisher of EC Comics. He did not come off so well. As a result, the comics publishers panicked. They thought that they were going to be all driven out of business, and they came up with a code, the comics code. And, no occult, no unnatural sexuality, no, law and order must always triumph, you name it. And every book that was published, every comic book that was published, first had to submit their stories to the office of the Comics Code and get it approved, and then their cover would be stamped with approved by the Comics Code Authority. And that meant that the people who sold comics, which at the time were newsstands and drugstores, could feel confident in putting this out, that they weren't going to get angry parents coming after them. Well, as the 60s turned into the 60s, there arose a group of cartoonists who did not want to have their stories subjected to the Comics Code, and they started self-publishing stuff that was mostly about, sex and drugs and rock and roll. And they sold them through underground bookstores, through head shops that sold drug paraphernalia. Robert Crumb, who is probably the best known of the underground cartoonists, sold his first issue of Zap out of a baby carriage that he wheeled around Haight-Ashbury. But then publishers arose, one of which was Kitchen Sink Press, and we have the records of Kitchen Sink Press, which was in business from 1968 to 1999. And Dennis Kitchen, who founded Kitchen Sink Press, is an archivist's dream because he kept everything. So every letter that he received, date with its envelope, date stamped with the date of receipt, chronologically ordered in folders with beautiful lettering, because Dennis is also an artist. Roughly 40,000 letters from everyone. So here's correspondence from Robert Crumb, who, he's an artist, he's drawing. And here's a really cool piece. Howard Cruz was a cartoonist who had just recently kind of tentatively put a foot out of the closet. And Dennis said to him one day in 1979, I want to start a comic book called Gay Comics. Would you like to edit it? And Howard was a little apprehensive. He also didn't know who else was gay in comics. And what he did was he went through Dennis's entire Rolodex, or contacts list. And he sent a letter to everybody saying, I don't know if you're gay or straight. I'm sending this to everybody. We're starting this comic book. We're looking for this kind of content. What do you say? And this is that letter. It went on to be quite a success. He was an editor for like the first 5 or 8 issues, I think maybe just 5, and then it went on to somebody else. But it went on for several issues until it was really no longer necessary, because people didn't need to be, gay cartoonists didn't need to be segregated in gay comics. But the spirit of the counterculture, started filtering in to the mainstream culture. The New Yorker has very stodgy, possibly, cartoons. Not always, actually. In the early years, they were pretty wild. But Charles Saxon, Columbia alumnus, Columbia College, 1941, donated his papers to us back in the 70s, so long before I was here, when I was still in high school. And he was known for doing these kind of very buttoned-down businessmen. I mean, he made fun of them, but he did these very buttoned-down businessmen. But this is Alma Mater, who you see in front of Low Library, but modernized for the age of women's liberation. Yeah.
Is this 1773?
No, it's 1973. Believe me, women weren't dressing like that in 1773. This was the rise of women's liberation. So this is Alma Mater with her consciousness raised. Okay. Moving on. I confess I'm not a huge superhero reader. I didn't grow up reading superheroes. I grew up reading Archie and European comics in translation. But we have some superhero representation. I bought this very nice page at auction for a ridiculously reasonable price for a Superman page. It's inked, it's penciled by Kurt Swan, who was a major Superman artist. It's inked by Murphy Anderson, who was a real star at DC Comics. Why did I get this at a reasonable price? Why did I get this at a price that I could afford? It's a Superman comic, but Superman isn't on this page. Clark Kent is on this page. Clark Kent doesn't sell like Superman sells. So this is Clark Kent is parachuting and he's going, I think, over a volcano that's going to burn off all of his clothes. And it does burn off all of his clothes, but he's got his Superman suit on underneath, so he's saved. But it's, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term Kirby Crackle, but this kind of, these little round black dots are a technique developed by Jack Kirby to indicate like energy or power. In this case, just the flames and rage of the volcano. But I like that Murphy Anderson put in Kirby Crackle. I'm going to pass this over for a second and just, this is a page not by anybody particularly famous. I've never heard of either the penciler or the inker personally. It's from a 1998 issue of Silver Surfer. But when I teach my course in the summer, I like people to think about how the story is being told, what tools the creators use that are auxiliary to the narrative, but that which propel the narrative. And we talk a lot about page layout and panel composition and use of spotted blacks and use of color and shape of speech balloons and types of lettering. And I bought this because I thought it was a really, really cool layout that I could have my students look at and talk about. I just think it's beautiful. I like the angled top. I like the 5-panel progression of things getting closer and then farther away and then closer again. It's just nice, right? It's just a nice page.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't I just have a nice page? But I can use it to teach with, which is, kind of our mission. So this is something that was offered to me out of the blue. In 1991, Marvel Comics decided to go from a privately held company to a public company. And to do that, they had to do an IPO, initial public offering, which was successful. And once they became a public company with shareholders, they had to issue reports. They employed a guy named Gary Fishman, who ran his own little PR firm. And he developed the idea that the reports of a comic book company should be done as comics. So you've got the top artists of the Marvel bullpen at the time, John Romita Jr., John Buscema, you name it, doing, having the Hulk talk about profits and, here's Stan Lee. It gets a little bit more nitty-gritty near the back, but it's just full of comics. And they did this for several years until they suddenly were facing bankruptcy, although they did survive. But this is all of the quarterly and annual reports. This is the awards that they won. This is the press coverage, because this got a lot of attention in the financial press. So it's just another kind of behind the scenes of a comic book company, how things function. So I'd like to talk about what things are worth. We have things in Rare Books that may not have a lot of cover value, right? But that are valuable in other ways. So this is a French graphic novel by a French cartoonist named Killoffer, published by L'Association, which is a kind of independent publisher founded by 5 or 6 cartoonists. If you go to France and you buy a comic at a convention and the artist is there and you ask the artist to sign it, you don't get just a signature. You get sometimes an extremely elaborate drawing. And people very happily wait in line while somebody up front gets a drawing. This is not particularly elaborate, but Killoffer did this lovely cow that is inscribed to Mark, for Mark, from Killoffer. Mark Nevins gave us this collection. So this probably went for 79 francs. So this is, pre-Euro. 79 francs, not a lot of money, but priceless. So it goes up to Rare Books because we don't want anybody walking out with that one. Here's an even better example. The same guy, Mark Nevins, gave us just a massive collection, and a lot of it had mini comics. So here's a mini comic. This probably sold for $3, maybe. 1999. Yeah, $3 tops. It's an anthology. It's got a lot of people who went on to become fairly famous. But when I opened it up, when I was doing the inventory, I discovered that on the first page there was a match and a burnt hole. And I thought, do I want to put a match in Rare Books where we have 4 levels of extremely old paper? Well, we have an in-house conservation lab. So I took it down and I said, what do you think? And they said, give it to us. So first they neutralized the sulfur, and then they sprayed a fixative here so that it wouldn't continue to crumble. Then they put this nice cover over it. Then they built this lovely case for it, which inside says, match was treated by conservation. So nobody ever has to worry again. So I can't even tell you the amount of money and man hours that was spent on this thing that went for $3. But this is how we roll. We take care of our stuff. You've seen a few women cartoonists. We don't have enough, I think, women cartoonists in our papers, sadly, because not a lot of women cartoonists have reached the level of stature where Columbia is going to ask for their papers. So I created this little collection called the New York City Comics Community Collection, so that I could take the very small amount of money I have and actually pay somebody for something and inject a little diversity into the group. So this is a Palestinian-American cartoonist named Marguerite Debye, and she keeps, this is Daly's book, March 2011 to 2012, and every day she does a comic strip. She does a little diary comic strip. Very intricate. She's a very good cartoonist. And mostly they're in black and white. Sometimes little color shows up. And so I bought this. I bought this from her to, have some women, have some non-Western women in the collection. This is something that has a kind of personal attachment for me. So in 2011, I was a judge for the Eisner Awards, which are the big awards of the comic book industry that are given out at San Diego Comic-Con. And when you're a judge, you have to read everything that was published the year that you're a judge for. And you sit with your other judges and you come up with nominations in 30 plus categories. So one day, maybe 3-4 years after I was a judge, I'm at a talk, a comics talk, and we're waiting for it to begin, and I'm sitting next to this guy, and we start chatting, and, what do you do? I'm a librarian. Really, what do you do? I'm a cartoonist. Oh, really? What's your name? Stephen. Oh, Stephen what? Stephen DeStefano. Are you the Stephen DeStefano who did Lucky in Love? He's like, yes. I said, I was an Eisner judge the year that you got nominated for art. Needless to say, we're still very good friends. And he donated his entire archive to us. So this is original art from Lucky in Love. He doesn't do comics anymore. He's an animator. He actually just won an Emmy for character design for Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal. He designed all the characters for Primal, if you watch that on Adult Swim. But he's a very good cartoonist. He started at the age of 15 drawing for DC Comics. They hired him when he was 15. And now he's won Emmys. He's good. He's good. And he gave us just everything. This is something that's not yet in our collection. And it won't be in our collection until I'm dead. Because this belongs to me. When I was a kid, the book that was most important to me was, well, the books were Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. I basically wanted to escape, and this was a really good example of a girl who got away. And as I became more and more embedded in the comics industry, I realized I know all these cartoonists. I can't buy a piece of art from all of them, but maybe they do a sketch for me. I'll start a sketchbook and I'll theme it around Alice, because everybody knows the story, everybody knows the characters, and there's so many characters to choose from. So this is volume 4. And I just go, this is somebody who I've admired since I was in my 20s. Yeah, this is a great cartoonist named Laura Park, Turkish cartoonist named Özge. I can't pronounce her last name.
So cute.
Yeah. Yeah. Pete Russ, a kind of indie cartoonist. This is a well-known political illustrator named Steve Brodner, and that's actually him. So it's I have space to go. And this is actually, I didn't bring this with me on a trip to Italy that I made in May, but I went to Bologna and I met with these people who decided to throw this little party to introduce me to all these indie cartoonists in Bologna. So I ran out and I found a sketchbook, but quick. And so they did comics for me. They did drawings for me as well. I love this one so much.
Wow.
It's funny. So this one, she had this overnight. We were at overnight, right? She's not a cartoonist, she's an illustrator. I met her at dinner at friend's house. She was staying over at their house. I had my book with me, because anytime I think there might be an artist in the vicinity, I have my book with me. And at the end of dinner, I said, would you draw on it? She goes, can you leave it with me? I said, sure. And this was handed back to me the next day, looking like that. So some people are just more talented than anybody has a right to be. And now we're going to go to the last table. If I still have your attention. And this is the international table. So I didn't buy this. This was bought by our librarian for Slavic Studies. This is a Polish comic. It's in Polish. I have no idea what it's about. He just told me he'd bought it. This is the character. I don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy. I like his face.
Cool.
It's cool, right? And it's beautifully drawn. And if you knew Polish, you would know the story. This is another cool thing. We are the only library in the world that I know of that has it. In the world. I got this because I know a guy. So I know an illustrator named Stefano Imbert, who's an Italian man who I was on the board of the Society of Illustrators with for a few years. And he had invited me to dinner at his home with his husband, and we were chatting. He said, Karen, he goes, I got this thing. I went to this party at the Italian embassy, and they were handing out this thing, and I don't want it. And it's so heavy, and it's, big. This thing's really heavy. Would you be interested? I'm like, well, what is it? And he brings it out, and this is 51 little comics done by Italian cartoonists about some sort of cultural thing, whether it's a museum or a statue, or it's like they're all listed here. So the Gallery Borghese in Rome, the Gallery dell'Accademia in Florence, the National Gallery of Modern and Contemporary Art in Rome. So there's a comic dedicated to all of these things. There's 51 of them in this lovely little box. And it's called Fumetti nei Musei, Comics in the Museums. And we have it. I love stuff that only we have.
Of course.
Yeah, I'm very competitive. This is an odd thing that technically isn't comics. And I bought it with, because it was insanely expensive, I bought it with my colleague who buys artist books. And I learned about this. I didn't even see it in person. I learned about it. How did I learn about it? So there's an annual festival called Works on Paper, and all sorts of paper artists come and they display things. And I didn't go, but I was looking at the website and I saw this thing. And it was going, she only made, I think, 10 of them, 10 or 12 of them, because this is a very complex piece of art and construction. So she lived in the city of Cannes in France, in the south of France, for a year, and this is basically her Cannes. This is like the places that she walked, things that she saw.
Wow, that is really cool.
It's really cool, and there's more on the back. You've got like this little group of people who are in little, I mean, there's just, it's everything. It was, I think it was going to retail for something like €8,000, but she had a special festival price. Which was considerably less. And I went in halves on it with my colleague who buys our artist books, because technically this is an artist book, but it's kind of also comics. And we own it. And only 11 other people in the world own it.
Wow.
Because she only made 12 of them. And then finally, this is what's known as a leporello, or accordion book. This is done by a French-Canadian cartoonist named Julie Doucet, who does really interesting and bizarre work. This is the French edition that was also done by L'Association, the same one who did the Kill Offer one with the cow. She designed it as an accordion book. The English translation, which was published by Drawn and Quarterly, a comics publisher in Montreal, was done as a codex. But that's boring. I wanted that, so I got our French vendor to send us this. So, any questions?
Which is your favorite piece in this collection?
I really love the 1766 cartoon, and I really love the Harriman drawing with the photograph. But my favorite thing is usually the most recent thing I acquired.
What is the most recent thing you've acquired in like the whole comics and cartoons?
Oh, actually, I'm going to tell you something that probably is my favorite thing. This is a social media saga. I got tagged in the comments of an Instagram post by somebody who I don't even really know. And the feed belonged to somebody I didn't follow. He's a sculptor who works also as an assistant to a famous sculptor, and he buys weird Americana at auction and then puts it up on his Instagram feed and says, I'm going to sell it. So it's like functions as his catalog. So I was tagged in the comments for a post of something that he said. He goes, "This is not yet for sale. This is the most unusual thing I have ever seen in my entire life. It's a scrapbook that was started by a barber in Fredonia, Kansas in 1928. He clipped comic strips, a specific comic strip called Wash Tubs, and he put it in this scrapbook, 2 per page, for his customers to read while they were waiting to get their hair cut. But as time wore on, he would like maybe write little notes or make little drawings, and his customers would write little notes or make little drawings, and this thing grew and grew and grew and grew until it outlasted its binding, outlasted the back, needed another piece of leather underneath that was tied together to the back. It weighs 35 pounds.
Whoa.
It's about 1 foot high. And it was just magnificent. And I wanted this thing more than I wanted life itself. So I sent a DM to the guy, and I said, "I know it's not for sale, but when you decide, if and when you decide to sell it, I hope you'll let me know. I would love to bring this to Columbia. He got back to me immediately. He's like, I would love for it to be at Columbia. Do you want to come out and see it? I'm like, yeah, I do. This was the height of the pandemic. I literally walked. I live here in Morningside Heights. I walked to Ridgewood, Queens. It took me 3 hours. And I looked at this thing, and you could barely open it because the things that he had put to create a binding were like these little dowels. But I said, yeah, I want this. How much? And he told me a number that ordinarily would be out of reach. But it was the pandemic, and we hadn't been allowed to buy anything for months. So I had this backup in my funds, and it was like exactly how much money I had left. So I said, okay, let me just talk to my boss. I sent an email with the Instagram post, which had multiple photos, to my director and to the head of conservation. And I said, I know this is going to require some care. I know it's going to require some kind of special cradle so that people can look at it, and some kind of special storage box. And that's why I'm, CCing the head of conservation. And she wrote back, she goes, wow, this is amazing. But it's going to require this, 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 and this. It's going to cost about $5,000. Okay. I didn't think that was a problem until my director wrote to me off list, so to speak, and said, all of our conservation funds are allocated for like the next 10 years. Because they handle all of our exhibition stuff, and that like uses our entire budget. He said, I am reluctant to add something to our collection that was unusable and will remain unused for the indefinite future. And I'm like, but, and he was pretty adamant. So I got really cranky, and I went on Facebook, and I wrote this kind of blind item. It's like, I just saw a thing. It's super cool. I need $5,000. I can't use my book funds to pay for it. And I'm going to have to give it up because I don't have $5,000 for conservation. In the comments, somebody wrote, check your email. Oh. And in my email was a message from a woman named Maggie Thompson, who is a goddess of fandom. She's like a patron saint of comics. And she said, Karen, I just sold 3 pieces of original art at auction for way more than I thought they were going to go for. What do you need the $5,000 for? So I sent her the post, and she said, I'm sending you a check. Oh. That's not the end of the story, though. Oh. So I get the okay to buy it. It comes on site. I meet with our head of conservation. She's like, the only thing we're going to be able to do, the only way we're going to let people read this is we're going to have to disbind it, digitize all the pages, reassemble the thing for its artifactual value, and have people look at the digital version. The problem is that Washtubs was still in copyright. So we could not put it up on the public web. It would have to go on our little private thing that you have to come here to look at. And that made me cranky. I don't like it when I'm cranky. So I thought, okay, so who holds the copyright? And I looked it up, and the original copyright holder, the syndicate, had gone out of business, and they'd sold it to a publisher named Andrews McMeel. And I didn't know anybody at Andrews McMeel, but I did know the former editor-in-chief at King Features. So I wrote to him, and I said, hey, do you know anybody at Andrews McMeel? This is why, blah, 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 blah. He said, I do know somebody. I actually asked him if he knew anybody in permissions. He said, yeah, I know somebody in permissions, but I'm actually going to connect you to the editor-in-chief, because the person in permissions might say no because they think that the editor-in-chief will say no. But the editor-in-chief's word is law. So he introduces us on email, and I send him this email that says, we've got this thing. It has transformative value because of all of these writings. It's a record of a small town during the Depression. The last reprint of Washtubs came out in the 80s. It's out of print. Nobody's going to lose any money. What do you say? And he said, sure. So now if you go on Internet Archive, you can see all 1,540 pages of the Persinger scrapbook. And that, I think, might be my favorite thing.